coordinating artillery. I'm just going to keep it from there because I'm going to let our guest today kind of explain the different levels because there's quite a bit of moving parts here and the career that Bruce Matthews had. I'm just going to be focusing on Italy, so Sicily and some of the fighting on the mainland. Not going to be talking about Normandy because got to cut off somewhere. So and Matthews has had quite an interesting career. So we're going to get probably talk a little bit about his earlier career, and then all that going along with that is him being part of the non-permanent active militia. Again, sorry, I apologize for non-Canadian military historians. These titles can get a little confusing, and we'll try to keep it as clear as possible. So with that said, if you like the work and the channel, please consider becoming a patron or becoming a YouTube channel member. A little bit each month goes a long way in helping me keep bringing these live streams to you. So thanks, Stephen, for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah, no, it's all my pleasure. And thanks again for you passed me your paper forward, and I got through most of it. I have other things I have to do in a given day, as I'm sure everyone else does. So I kind of cherry pick some stuff, but I'll just kind of let you go with kind of an overview and kind of go from there. I have a few questions, and then, of course, anyone watching, please questions, comments anytime, and we'll do our best to field them. Well, Stephen will, not me. But yes, so that said, like I already said to you, and how I'm sure people know with live stream is, how do you get to this? This is Canadian military history. Sorry, I'm gonna say this is pretty niche, but this is pretty niche for pretty niche. Like this is a pretty niche one. So I'm really interested to hear how you got here.
Yeah, the niche of the niche. Well, I'm a gunner by background, so I'm actually a major in the Royal Canadian Artillery. And I'm also a historian by education. Not done a PhD yet, just master's level. Did undergraduate at RMC, and then I did a master's at RMC again for Master's of War Studies. And during the Master's of War Studies, I decided to do a director research project, and I'm really into command, levels of command, how people commanded, and that's kind of my jam, fair to say, when I do my studies. And so, being a gunner, I wanted to take a look at a gunner in command. And when you look at gunners in command in the historiography, the Canadian one specifically, a lot of it's maneuver, right? So we got a lot of stuff on Simmons, we got stuff on McNaughton, the political aspects, politics command. I know we have some upcoming stuff on Simmons as well, probably due out in a year or two.
Yep.
And that's all maneuver stuff. You know, the time as Corps Commander, time as Army Commander for McNaughton, and a little bit for Simmons. But no one's really looked in depth at how have gunners commanded their guns and advised. You know, we have a lot of great work done on the technical aspects. I mentioned in the paper that we have Colonel Dave Grubstad has done a lot of good articles on technical integration and the fire plan in Sicily. We've got Guns of Bretteville for Mark Milner. So a lot of the technical stuff has started to be kind of scratched at from an artillery perspective.
Right.
But I wanted to look at how does someone command the guns, but also, you know, that human aspect, but also do the technical side as well, because there's a lot of that with gunnery. And so I adopted my advisor, Dr. Doug Delaney, kind of showed me the path, and I'm a big proponent of the human and the technical kind of analytical lens for command. Human being those human skills, how do you deal with people, how do you train people, how are you from a human compassionate, or when you need to fire people aspect. And then the technical side is pretty clear from, you know, both the tactical and technical pursuits for the guns. So I started looking into gunners in command and stumbled upon Bruce Matthews. And quite fascinating to me, because as you alluded to, he has quite the career. So he starts the war as a major, and we can get into the background a little bit, but like starts the war as a major, coming straight from the militia, ends it as a major general in charge of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division. And picks it up after the shell fighting. So a lot of rebuilding had to be done there. To go from major battery commander to that at the end of the Second War, there's quite a lot there. And in between, we'll get into, he has all various levels of command, some of them being artillery, some being, infantry division fighting. But how do you do it? So I kind of circled around and said, how is this possible that someone, there are examples, Hoffmeister being one of them as well, probably the most well-known one, where someone from the militia comes in, is very successful, and displays quite the aptitude to command at high levels. So I kind of cut the problem down. I decided to look at it from a education pre-war perspective. How did he receive training as he went through? So how was he trained in mentor as a major and a lieutenant colonel and then a brigadier general?
Yeah.
And then how did he exercise his command in Sicily and the mainland of Italy, as you allude to, as the CRA, as it's called, so Commander Royal Artillery, for the infantry division. But that's kind of the background, is how I got into it.
Yeah, that's that's great. I mean, sorry, a lot of that comes through in the paper you sent me of how that's laid out, all these steps. Because again, I kind of think of it that way because it's kind of almost quintessential Canadian World War II story, right? Starting at a lower position and then by the end being in charge of a whole division. Like it's so interesting to see. Like sorry, when we first started talking about doing this show, the first thing I thought of is that picture that's taken, First Canadian Army, all the commanders down to the divisional level, all sitting there. And it's just the people that are like Hoffmeister, Matthews. It's just they wouldn't have been there even close at the beginning. So it's really interesting that that's how that finishes up. Anyway, we can probably get into that a little bit. But the one thing I did want to talk about, and now the wheels are turning again, is which is something really interesting, and maybe you can talk a little bit about if that's okay, is Matthews went to Upper Canada College. And the only reason I'm asking about that is because so did CRA. And this came up in my own work. Because it's interesting because Stephen Leacock was a teacher at the time, or whatever they called him. I forget what they called him, instructor or something like that. So like that's so interesting that all of these individuals are connected. I was wondering if you could just talk about that a little bit, because I know Matthew's personal background connects to his military career and why he was in, the non-permanent active militia. If you could just talk about that a little bit, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I found as I went through it, his personal background actually sets in my view, the conditions for success later on in his career. So as you alluded to, Matthews went to UCC, or Upper Canada College. Leacock wrote an article, I think it was like 6 generals or something that he taught, something like that around that. Went through UCC. It's interesting. So, and another interesting perspective from the Matthews family background is that, so he comes from a family of means. His father's a stockbroker and a very successful one in the 20s and into the 30s. And his father actually becomes the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario in 1937 when Bruce resigns because he doesn't like that, I can't remember, it was the Hepburn government is cutting essentially costs. So trying to show the public that, we're not living extravagantly. Look, the Lieutenant Governor is not, doesn't have a house, whatever. And his father had prominent connections. It's funny, it's in the Mackenzie King diary papers, is that essentially they're like, oh, this guy is really connected. What if we could bring him on as Lieutenant Governor? So if his father becomes Lieutenant Governor, and you would think, I kind of went into it with a little bit of bias too, where I was like, okay, super connected. That must have had a role to play. But if you look at all the interviews in Granatstein's Way to Command and some of the other material, everyone that talks about Matthews mentions him as, he may have been connected, but it was pure like talent and it was pure ability or human compassion. So anywho, he goes to Upper Canada College. He actually takes the test, the entrance test for RMC, and fails it.
Yeah,
so
that was interesting. Yeah.
RMC, but instead takes advantage of his position and goes off to Europe. So he goes to Geneva, essentially we call it auditing, but like takes classes in Geneva, sits in on stuff, and then is called back to Toronto to become part of the family business, work in stocks, work in brokerage, and he joins 7th Toronto Regiment as a militia officer. But as he joins the regiment, he actually gets a couple of great opportunities. So one of the great opportunities that's afforded to him is he gets to take the militia staff course. So the militia staff course gives him, an appreciation for orders, organization, staff procedures, all those things. And I'm unable to draw a precise link on how, but he was also allowed or selected to go to the artillery long course. So more of a regular course. So he gets taught by permanent officers more of a reg force qualification, or a regular force qualification at the time as well. So in his initial days in the militia, really give him the educational background, for lack of a better term, on how to be a junior officer and the technical skills required to be an artillery officer. And he goes through the 30s in his life as a militia. He kind of he gets some opportunities, but he's also being hamstrung because the militia at the time, they're getting the cuts, right?
Yeah.
The concept is they'll train individual skills. This is Canada-wide. Like they train individual skills and then they do concentrations or camps in the summer to do what we would call collective training now. And a lot of these camps get sacrificed at the altar of budget cuts.
Oh, yeah.
So, but what ends up happening is a lot of the permanent force gunners, because there's a great relationship between the permanent force and militia at the time, end up teaching in Toronto and in the militia armories some of the reg force items required you'd have it for collective training. So Matthews benefits actually by being trained from some regular force gunners who have attended Caverly, attended Keta, they've attended the regular staff college. So he's getting that kind of experience even as a member of 7th Toronto. So he qualifies as a lieutenant and his career starts to go off and he becomes the adjutant. And by the start of the war, he actually finds himself as a battery commander. So he has one live fire camp, I guess, as a battery camp with his militia battery. And he does get some experience training them. But it's, as you could say, it's very limited comparatively to what he would get in the war. But it's, I always like to compare it and contrast it when I was researching this to, there's a paragraph in the Soldiers General where Delaney points out that Hoffmeister had never seen orders. He's never seen an orders format. And he's kind of very nervous when he goes to the staff college course in Canada. And if you look at Matthew's background, Matthew's upbringing, for lack of a better term, in militia, he's seen orders. He's had the staff course. He's had the technical gunnery long course. And he's had some capacity to practice these skills, both at a militia camp and with permanent force officers. And making those relationships, one could bet, I can't prove, but one could bet by dint of his family connections and ability to move about his capacities. But that's kind of his pre-war thing. So I draw a connection that while, yes, his position affords him opportunities, he definitely makes the most of them. And he makes the most in ways that potentially many other people, especially in rural militias out in the West or in Atlantic Canada, would not have of those opportunities, being in Toronto and being close to the center, I guess you could say, Kingston, Quebec, and Ottawa of regular force officers.
Yeah, sorry, I just gave you a break there, but that's one of the things that really struck me. And again, you make the comparison within the paper too, but to Hoffmeister, and just clicked in my brain, you didn't know how to write orders, which was kind of sad and funny at the same time. But it's so interesting that he was able to get this experience in I don't want to say secondhand way because that's not the right word, but you know what I mean. That sort of learning from others, I guess, that in the non-traditional channels was something that was really striking to me because you don't hear that very often, right? In terms of the Second World War experience for commanders, especially those who rise later. That was very striking to me that he had those opportunities. Taking the course for the artillery was something I knew about, but I'd never heard of anyone doing it like that. So that was really interesting. So another thing I wrote down around the same time when I was going through it, and it might be it's a bit of a quick aside here, but it was kind of inevitable, is how he got along with people. Particularly, I have one name written down. I'm sure you can guess what it is. That was interesting to me because you really focus on that ability of him to learn how to, I don't know, again, lead people I'm not sure what the word is here because you combined it better than I can think of off the top of my head. Those technical and the people skills, I guess. Did that stand out for you of something that he was able to do better than say some others?
It really stood out to me, and the thread, I guess I could say, that I first found on an inkling of, wow, this person might have had excellent command or human skills, for lack of a better term, is when, like I mentioned, is that you go through those interviews with Granatstein, and there's very, very few comments that are critical or negative towards him as a human interaction perspective. There might have been critical comments about his performance or the technical aspects, which some are deserved, but he generally gets along very well with everyone. And as we'll see later on when we get to Italy, he ends up serving under Simmons and Vokes, which is big. To be able to traverse and work for two completely separate, distinct commanders
Yeah.
such as Vokes and Simmons, but be well respected and I wouldn't say loved, but like very
Yeah.
very happy to receive the advice that both did from both of them. In fact, he's actually becomes great friends with Simmons after the war, which is another, it's an accomplishment.
I know. That's a story you don't hear. Is
Yeah,
um,
it's funny, and it's on the human aspect is that an aside as well. When he works for Vokes after Simmons leaves, Vokes really appreciates the work that gets done at the Moral River, loves the way he's organized the divisional artillery. And then when Ziegler comes in after, and because Matthews gets pulled back to the
yeah,
Second King Corps to prepare for Normandy, Vokes just goes to town on Ziegler. The first interaction doesn't go well. He berates Ziegler. And Ziegler notes even that, I'm in the doghouse because I changed things that he thought
yeah,
Matthews put in there for a reason, which Ziegler proves himself to be quite confident as well when we get to the Gothic and Hitler lines.
yeah,
But it speaks to that connection that Matthews is able to draw with not only his superiors, but with as well with his gunners.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Because that's one thing you. Sorry, I just saw Norma's comment about Simmons. Always gets her riled up every time. That's also why I bring it up, because it's fun, and it's fun to see Norma get all worked up about him, because it's without fail, it's like a clock. No, I was gonna forget what I was gonna say. Oh yeah, how you focus on the training. I want to get to that in a second, because actually I want to get to this question before I get. So from Great Dominion with Vokes, because I know you mentioned that part too of like when he leaves, that Vokes is like, don't touch anything, you're doing everything wrong. Did they have a post-war relationship at all? Did they get along after that, or any insights you can give there?
Unfortunately, I didn't get the scope of his relationship with Vokes post-war.
Yeah.
But to answer Great Dominion's question, during the war, they got along really well. Vokes gets thrown into the crossing. I have to pull up the name here. Just as they come into the Moral River Valley, and they have to force that crossing initially before they get into the valley. Vokes gets told by Alfrey, the Corps commander, like, get after it. And he's under a lot of pressure, a ton of pressure. And Matthews kind of is one of the more steadfast people that's trying to make it work from a supporter perspective. And Vokes really appreciates it, and that kind of drives that relationship. And the relationship between Vokes and Matthews really gets forged in the Moral Valley because they have the crossing, and then they get up to Cider Crossroads, which is the that ends up happening from a fire perspective.
Yeah, that one's anyway, maybe we can talk about that one in a bit. But I just wanted to, because that part really stuck out to me, is that personal relationship. Again, maybe you talk about this too, is a bias of the literature, the scholarship, is you don't often hear about that. The guns are kind of the thing in behind, the thing that, they seem to almost be, what's the word I'm looking for here? Just not automatic, because there's issues with artillery. It happens. But the kind of the thing that's hey, you brought that up in like the third page or something of your paper there. I saw, and you're a gunner, so anyway, it's just you don't often think about that personal connection within, say, like a gun team. You hear about that like in a tank crew or down at the squad level, but you don't really hear that within a battery. So that was really cool to hear about.
It's I guess, and most gunners who would listen to this would know from their experience, is that the interesting thing being a supporter to the infantry and the armor is that you work for two bosses. One, you have your maneuver commander boss. So you have the maneuver arms that you're supporting, you're making plans for, you're giving advice, and you're trying to integrate that fire support into their formation. But you also have your artillery boss. So Matthews would have a CCRA above him, and he owes loyalty back down to the artillery regiments. So it's a very interesting balancing act that engineers and artillery have to apply, and other supporters as well, where they have to manage two personalities, two bosses, and they also have to demonstrate loyalty up and down both chains, and trying to manage the morale up and down both chains. And I guess it's hard to describe from a historical aspect unless you have kind of a background of seeing it, right? Like, because it's easy to describe a technical chain, but if you lived it in real life, then you kind of get like, oh man, I've got to work for all these personalities, and how do I have to make all these personalities fit together?
Yeah, it's really interesting because again, that's that rise that he has. It's quite quick. I mean, it's not unexpected. I mean, as a historian of this stuff, I mean, there's lots of examples of it. But I was just wondering if you could talk about that real quick, just kind of a quick overview of what he does once the war does begin, because I think that would be good to kind of um, cover that a little bit because it's there's a lot and it's quick, so it's really interesting to hear.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
also, we got another gunner in attendance. We got lots. You guys always seem to travel in packs.
That's a new one. I like that. I'm gonna take that. Gunners travel in packs.
I don't know. Every time I just started thinking it because it's true.
There's
Anytime
always,
I see artillery and like there's like 4 of you just show up.
yeah, some things that never change.
Yep.
And absolutely, it's funny because when I did the research for his initial, I guess you could say, experiences when the war breaks out to when he goes into action in Sicily and the mainland, it seems like, oh man, there's so much that happened. It happened so quick. But then you put it in perspective, it was like 3 years.
True. That's true.
And so war breaks out. Matthews is a major in the militia. He mobilizes. He deploys to England as a battery commander in early 1940. But when he gets there, unfortunately, classic like mobilization things happen, and his battery is disbanded. It's merged with another battery, and can't have two majors at the helm. So he is the odd man out, and he finds himself jobless for a time. So for a month or two, he kind of feels like, oh, this might be the end of my war. I might not see action.
Yeah.
What's going to happen? But he finds himself posted into command of it's the 3rd of 23rd of 1st Medium Regiment. So he goes into the medium gun realm, which is more of a divisional support asset than a direct support asset.
Yeah.
So he's a battery commander in 323 battery, and he adjusts to the medium support lifestyle. But essentially, what he figures out and what is going on across the same things in the Canadian contingent is everyone needs that individual training, and Matthews realizes it. Like you can't jump. He knows you can't jump in as a new battery commander of this newly put together battery and expect to go, let's do troop fire planning right away, or let's do battery level shoots right away. Matthews is smart enough from his previous staff and training and his militia experience to realize that. So what I found is that he's an excellent trainer at this time. If you look through the war diaries for the battery and the regiments that he's serving in at the time, it is almost like staff college-esque training program. Like in the morning, we're going to do individual skills here. We're going to do radio procedures here. And Charlie Troop is going to do survey here. And it's all planned out week by week, month by month, which you can't say the same for all the units of the 1st Canadian Division and all the units trained in England at this point in time in 1940 or late 1940 rather. So he prescribes a training plan. He focuses on those individual skills like the guns, radio procedure, calculating firing data, all the technical stuff. And after training from March and April in 1940, by May he takes them to the range for the first time. So he gives 2 months of non-range training, getting all those individual skills down, trying to get the battery ready to go live, as we would say. So they go to the range, and here's the other flip side of the coin where I see from the human perspective is that much like maybe it's why he's friends with Simmons, is like he's not afraid to essentially address failure.
Right.
So when he sees problems, when he sees issues with the battery, when they go live and they do the first shoot, he addresses it. So he sees some training, he tries to redress it in the summer. And in August, he kind of gives his battery officers another go, and they go out to the field and they're part of a live fire exercise. And it doesn't go well. So he ends up sacking his gun position officer as well as 2 command post officers. So he basically strips the whole battery leadership and has them replaced. And at the time, so August 1940, we also kind of put it in context and perspective. That's when we're heading into Battle of Britain. We're heading into, there could be a cross-channel issue here coming up. So it's pretty bold to start over when your unit may be part of Southeastern Corps, I believe it was, the Home Corps, essentially, that the Canadians get attached to as a task.
Yep.
So as well, and the IGs in the crowd will appreciate this, he removes these officers 3 to 4 days before he's scheduled to shoot in front of instructor and gunneries in Larkhill, before he's scheduled to take the subunit up to Larkhill and to do a shoot. So it's quite bold, but he ends up taking officers he's never worked with and goes up under the critical instructor and gunnery eyes. But it pays off. So the battery ends up improving, does well, and he gets put up into Regimental 2IC of the same medium regiment. So he stays in the family, moves up, and his battery command time is over in September of 1940. He spends a fair amount of time as a Regimental 2IC. And at that time as well, in gunner doctrine, he does have in training. Surveyors are under the Regimental 2IC's purview at this point. So he's working on training as well. He's kind of advising the new battery commanders. He's giving them advice on how to create a plan. He's advising the CO on issues within the regiment. And he's doing the 2IC thing where he goes about the countryside. If the regiment gets moved in support of an exercise, he goes and looks at the billets, and he does all the logistical organization that comes along with the role.
Yep.
But as a year goes by, it's not too long before he finds himself in command of a unit. So flip forward a year as being 2IC, September to August 1941. So we're in 41 now, and he's sent to command a unit. So he's given 7th Medium Battery, which is basically the nucleus of 5 Medium Regiment that's about to be created and expanded. He's been given the command of this regiment, and McNaughton personally informs him that you're about to get this regiment. So it kind of speaks to the esteem, I guess, he's being held in at this point by the Canadian gunners that are in England. So he's actually given the opportunity to pick his soldiers for the unit. So he opts to go with what he knows, and he starts to integrate soldiers from 323 Battery back into his new unit. So he's bringing trusted agents, the people he knows, into his regiment. His regiment shows up in August 41, and he addresses them personally and kind of lays down that everyone has a role to play, they're all a team, and they'll have to focus on the task ahead, which really speaks to his buy-in. Like, as you see throughout a lot of his commands, he always seeks buy-in from the soldiers below him. And so he kind of implements the same thing that he does as a battery commander, just one step up. So now he's a regimental CO, so he implements individual skills training. He has his battery commanders train everyone on radio discipline, the guns. We repeat this process again, but at a regimental level, and it works out. So we move into September 1941. The regiment is complete. They start their training, and at this point in time, from a gunner perspective, I'm not an equipment guy, but I did have to dig into this for this one. Is that they start to flip out the old 18 pounders to like 5.5 inch. So they're getting 5.5 inch howitzers, and it's hard to describe this to an outside the gunner community, but he's not an instructor in gunnery, but he knows that what he doesn't know. So he knows that this is a new weapon system. He doesn't know how to operate it well or train it well. His soldiers don't. So he seeks out the support of Larkhill, and he seeks out the support of the instructor in gunneries, and it's more importantly the assistant instructor in gunneries in Larkhill to help him teach his unit. So he pays a visit up to Larkhill. They drag out a 5.5 howitzer, and they show some select soldiers of the unit. We call it train the trainer nowadays. They give them the rundown on the equipment and how to use it. And so as we see later on in October, we start to see in the war diaries that AKG start appearing at 5th Medium Regiment, and they start appearing in exercises, and they're starting to be kind of this one team concept where they're really getting the regiment ready to go. And it pays off well. They go through their first firing camp on exercises called Tiger in December. So from August to December is the training period individual, and then we start to see regimental firing in December of 41. And as they go through, he still has that critical eye. So he's still looking at the batteries. He's still saying, is it up to the standard we need to be if we go into action? And he's still not completely satisfied with it. And he orders some supplementary practice camps in February of 42. They have unit reports. It's not spectacular by the end of his time as a CO, but it's very functional. And I think that when you look at the Canadian military history, it's easy to kind of cast a critical eye on, when you see a unit report from, Salisbury Plains kind of thing, saying it didn't perform that well or it was mediocre in the terms. You also have to kind of balance that with the fact that these are freshly mobilized units, people with no trades training whatsoever in the actual skill they're employing, and to take it in 4 months and make it actually fire as a regiment live and work is pretty impressive, in my opinion. So in February 42, the unit is now working, and as is traditional in the military, when you get something working well, you are posted out. He's relieved as the CO he becomes the counter battery officer for 1st Canadian Corps. And it's interesting because we know McNaughton's background in counter battery in the First World War. So it's kind of like, if you're selected to be the counter battery officer of the Corps, you're under the eye. The eye is watching you. The eye has plans for you, and we see things in your future. So,
well, sorry, especially as under the guy who invented it. Like, as the government does it, it was all McNaughton. So it's just, that must have been some pressure. I'm going to keep going with this real quick, but I have a question. You already said you're not a technical equipment guy, but if you could just give us a quick rundown, because Scott does make a good question about what was actually used in terms of the actual guns.
Yeah, so the artillery support to division in 43, when they go into action in Sicily, is a divisional artillery support is 3 field regiments, an anti-tank regiment, and an anti-aircraft regiment. So that's what he has in his ORBAT. 3 field, 1 anti-tank, 1 aircraft. And the anti-tank is also, as an aside, something that slips through the historiography quite a bit. Because people don't wrestle with, like, how do you train this thing and how is it used? Because we kind of take modern, anti-tank weaponry for granted, and not the fact that it actually was executed by artillery in the Second World War. But yeah, 3 field regiments and anti-tank and a anti-aircraft regiment, and then layered on top of that, as he goes into Italy, are other support mechanisms. So corps artillery, medium regiments, things that EGRAs, as they come about, so artillery group or Army Group Royal Artillery, that provide layered support, as we'll see later on. But as his base command, 3 field regiments, an anti-aircraft regiment, anti-tank regiment.
Cool.
Oh yes, there's a great article that discusses that. I will share that. Yes, and I mentioned you in the paper as well, sir. That
I wonder who wrote that. I have no idea. Actually, real quick here. Why was he posted out? Is it just because he was picked by McNaughton, or what
it doesn't quite say in the war diaries, and unfortunately I didn't have access to his papers, because his family had donated the papers to the War Museum, and they're still being cataloged at the time I was doing my research.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I think they still are, to be honest.
Anyway. So someday we might get the personal aspect on it. But my read of the situation was, you've done good work here. It's not a negative. You've done good work, but we need you to get into more, as I would say, broadening opportunities. We want you to a higher artillery staff level and be prepared for further responsibilities. I see it as a prelude. I think it's a prelude to someone sees something in him, the way that he's been training and it's being shown off, and they're trying to prepare him for future possibilities.
Yeah, because it seems like it's that recognition of skill and not necessarily just because he's connected.
Yeah, and it's an interesting note. So he becomes a counter battery officer for 1st Canadian Corps, and the 2 people that were in the role ahead of him, maybe familiar to some gunners, is E.C. Plow and E.R. Suddy. So they're both permanent force officers, and they both go on to have prominent roles in the Canadian Artillery throughout. So he's kind of that first militia officer that's stepping into, as he alluded to at the start of the when you reference the picture at the start of the talk, is he's now starting to enter into that world where we wouldn't expect to see people like Bruce Matthews to be in there, especially in not early, but mid-war. Yeah. He's shown his capabilities, and now he's kind of entering into the conversation.
Cool.
Yeah. So anyway, he becomes the CBO, and he kind of ends up going around the countryside, being the eyes and ears of the Canadian Corps Counter Battery Office, and watching other things. So he's not actively influencing things. He's more of in a understanding and study mode for the next couple of months. He ends up doing exercise control for a couple of counter battery exercises, and it's interesting because you can see his analytical mind really shine. Is that when he's creating the exercise instructions for these exercises, they're concise, they're short, they're to the point. And I mean, when I was researching it, I sent a couple to Dr. Delaney. I was like, this is basically like at a staff college. You could show this as what they call it, the staff solution, and staff
Right.
college. And it would reflect that. So he's very, very sharp and analytical when he designs these things. So he continues his rise, and in January of 1943, he is appointed the Commander Royal Artillery of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division. And as Granatstein references, promotion strikes Matthews as mysterious. He's not seeking it, but it just seems to find him.
Yep.
Throughout his career. So he moves over, but it's not, in retrospect, it's not a surprise to me. He takes a hodgepodge battery, trains it well, has the tenacity and the willpower to fire people when they're not performing.
Yeah.
And also takes risks that end up paying off by implementing new officers, seeking help from British IGs, which there is a bit of, asking our British friends for assistance on things, technical matters, while we're trying to prove ourselves nationally, is also a risk to himself. So it's not a surprise to me that he gets picked, but now he is, as we enter into 1943, he is now the CRA of 1st Infantry Division.
And they're about to get a little busy.
Oh yeah, they're about to get a little busy. I just took a pause here to see if you have anything else to answer on that before I go into Italy. All right. So he, like I mentioned, as CRA, he's got 3 field regiments, an anti-tank and a anti-aircraft regiment to worry about. And it's a big, far more complex task than he's ever really faced in his career, but he's certainly up to the challenge. Within a week of taking command, he sets out, he basically almost Simmons-esque, he's in his little caravan, his office, and he sets out 2 instructions. So tactical exercise about troops, he sets out a bunch of training instructions for commanders at all levels within the divisional artillery on how they're going to train and learn to support their maneuver compatriots. And so he realizes, and I always like to flip back, my gold standard, the soldiers general, is that toots are the right choice here. And they're the right choice because it's a brand new command for him. People are new into the position, and you're not dragging soldiers out to make essentially see their leaders try and wrestle with complex problems and making mistakes before they end up having to go live into a situation. So he makes the right call, starts to do some and then, as you can see, he in some, and you get the criticism for McNaughton in his role as exercise controller in some exercises, but when Matthews runs them, he's in it. So when he runs a divisional artillery exercise, he does the appreciation. He goes through his role as commander, he makes a clear and logical appreciation, and then he gives out orders. There's no kind of sitting back, I am the overlord of this, and I'm just going to watch and see what happens. He's an active participant, which certainly must endear him to his staff and to his subordinates. So he does an appreciation for divisional operations. And again, it's another document that I flipped to my advisor, because I said, this looks at, in the staff college, I don't know if it's still there, but when I went through Army Staff College, they have the Simmons estimate for totalize as kind of, oh, look at this, this is this how clear and sharp it is. And Matthews is producing things of this nature as well. His estimate for divisional artillery is short, sharp, to the point, and it exists in the War Diary. It's definitely recommended for people to check it out. But he's making logical deductions, and he's showing that he understands the technical skills to execute divisional plans. So he's picking up on things like, if the Air Force is not going to be, enemy Air Force not going to be neutralized, I need my anti-aircraft regiment to do this by this time, and I integrate it with key things that need to be defended. So I only have X amount of heavy artillery and medium artillery. It's defending that and the headquarters, so on and so forth. He makes all these logical deductions. So they continue on their training, and at the same time, he's working the divisional piece, and he's trying to figure out, him and his staff, how they're going to fight the divisional fight. He is giving instruction to his regimental COs on how to fight the regimental fight. So concurrently, regimental toots are happening, and they're happening for captains to make them understand how regiments deploy from warning order and ending up with guns in action. So this is all going on concurrently. And then as they progress in their training, he does something I find very interesting, and I haven't seen in other research I've done in the Second World War, is he brings in the supported arms for the artillery specific training.
Okay.
So he brings in maneuver company commanders and COs to those regimental exercises that he gives to his COs, like his artillery COs. And he essentially injects them to give them like, okay, I would need this and this, and I want this in terms of support. And it gives that kind of element of realism of like, hey, you're not just putting guns out there to put guns out there. You're putting guns out there to support objective, to support the human, and to support someone on the ground. So that I find that very interesting. And he ensures that his people are not creating solutions, procedures, in isolation effectively.
Yeah.
So we move through 1943, and then we get into late February. They start looking at practicing how to make fire support happen for infantry brigades in offensive operations. They conduct a battle procedure. They're doing some more exercises. And then they're doing this now live. So they're going to the field, they're taking troops, they're taking guns, they're starting to set up and get ready to essentially fire in support of these exercises. And from a technical perspective, what we start to see is that Matthews understands that, or he gets an appreciation for, things happen quickly. You start to see these, people complain nowadays about shortened battle procedure timings, but it's a thing as well at this time in the war. Yeah. So he gets, 12 hours to make a divisional fire plan. So he understands that it can't be complex. It has to be short and sharp. It has to be, maybe not registered targets, concentrations, no time for a barrage. And he also understands that he has to give orders quickly. So he kind of adopts a method of just a quick fire plan trace and allocating resources to tasks. So he'll allocate a regiment to a brigade. He'll allocate maybe something in support of a regiment, reinforcing another regiment, as we would call it. And he starts to get an appreciation and make things happen fast. So March comes along, and he turns his attention from field regiment training to wrestling with those other problems that a commander of Royal Artillery has, and that's the anti-tank and the air aspect of his command. So he starts to go to anti-tank drills, anti-tank ranges, and he immerses himself in this practice. He kind of gets a feel for it. It's hard to say if it's effective or not effective, because we're literally at the point where they're just shooting weapon to target. How do we have a weapon system hit a target? We're not coordinating a plan together. We're shooting something on objective. It's more of a preparatory for anti-tank or a defensive weapon, and more in the defensive role. As we move into March, now we have the Mike, Uncle, Victor style of artillery control is starting to come around through all the British and Canadian artillery and all the Commonwealth ones. And for people to understand what that is, it's levels of concentration of fire. So you're calling for example, Mike target would be putting a regimental weight of fire onto something. You call an Uncle target, that's a simplified procedure to put all the divisional guns onto a single target or a single engagement. And so they're starting to practice these new procedures that are coming along. And so now we find ourselves in March at a point where the individual skills are practiced. He's practiced his staff at a divisional level. He's practiced kind of the niche capabilities of command, and he's had his regimental COs kind of practice the lower level support arms. Now we're ready to take the next step, and arguably the hardest step is, how do we train my regimental COs to support brigade operations? So now they're looking at supporting brigades in bespoke operations, and Matthews essentially resourcing, and COs having to come up with the plans themselves. So it starts with a toot, as is classic Matthews style. And here's another interesting thing that he does with the first fire support in brigade toots. So he takes all his regimental COs, he takes his 2 ICs, and he takes some of the captains of these units. He calls them all together, and they all come to wherever location, and they get their toot orders, and they're about to set out on their problems as a syndicate. But before they set out, he mixes them. So he takes, like, if you're a CO of 1 regiment, you're getting the 2 IC from 3 regiment. and you're getting a captain from 5 regiment, et cetera, et cetera. So he mixes everything around, and he forces them to go through the toot with people that they haven't been working with for the last 3 to 4 months to get fresh perspectives on it, and to also kind of like their only chance to cross-pollinate. So he forces this toot to essentially take different perspectives internally. I've never seen it in any training up until this point. Probably people have used it. He must have picked it up from somewhere, but I found it pretty novel and pretty interesting perspective. So they do these toots, and then they end up going to more specific training. The Gallop series of exercises, so Welsh for the 1st Canadian Infantry Division, and they're practicing opposed landing and breakout operations. So we're starting to see the tides moving towards there might be a specific task to which this formation gets assigned. So in April 43, he finds himself in London at Norfolk House, and he's receiving orders, as the division is, that yes, you're going to Sicily, you're going to be participating in the invasion of Sicily, and here's your specific problem set. At this point in time, also important to remember, it's Harry Salmon. It's not Simmons yet. It's still the GOC of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division.
Yep.
And so Salmon orders the division up to Scotland to do combined operations training in preparation for it. And another interesting thing I found is that as they kind of go there, they get the orders at Norfolk House, and then Salmon issues these orders, go up to Scotland for start training, while we and the staff, Salmon is going to keep his key staff back to create the plan, and the rest, everyone else, will go up and start training. Matthews makes a decision that is, I think, risky but well-intentioned, and it ends up paying off, is that he centralizes the artillery when it goes to Scotland. He does not allow his regiments to become affiliated with any brigades, and he does not allow specific brigade training. He says, you will stay as divisional artillery. I don't know how this is going to go. Just practice gunnery. Then practice gunnery in support of, occasional like combined arms, as the combined as it would say, but don't get comfortable, essentially, is what he gets to. And because he has the foresight to see that they haven't done the problem set, and he doesn't know how each regiment is going to end up supporting this problem. And if it's going to be a brigade allocation, is he going to centralize? Is he going to decentralize? So he kind of foresees this as a big problem set, and he says, stay together as an artillery while you train, and I'm going to sit here and kind of work out the problem. So he ends up doing the battle procedure and gets ready to go to Italy. And then we can move into that in a bit, or if we want to pause, take questions. I don't know how you'd like to move.
Yeah. Well, it's a very, I think it's an easy question about who's actually doing this fire direction. I know we're kind of past that in terms of Matthew's career at this point, but just real quick about the FOOs would be cool.
Yeah. So each battery has FOOs internally that would go forward and provide fire support to battalions, and the CO would provide fire support to battalions and brigade level. But the thing of it is like, as I was just kind of alluding to, is that Matthews isn't sure if there's going to be bespoke command relationships or tactical relationships between these regiments and the brigades. So while there are the traditional system of FOOs and regimental COs as advisors, he's not sure how he's going to allocate them or task them out yet for the operation. So yes, and as we'll see as we go through the Italian campaign, part of it is, in some instances, the FOOs are kind of setting the pace and the tempo and calling the fire and really creating what we call a fire plan by a series of engagements. And in some instances, it's very set piece. It's dictated and controlled by the divisional staff, and the FOOs are essentially teams that execute it, right? They have a target and they're going to go out, register, and execute it. So it's FOOs and naval fire officers exist. Naval gunfire officers exist, but how they're going to be used is situational dependent.
Yeah, if we can move to that now, because that was, sorry, I always find the naval fire support interesting and fascinating and how that works. I mean, that's the Normandy thing in me, but it's interesting to hear it too for Sicily.
Yep. So now we've got everything planned. We've got everyone's on the boats essentially. We're ready to rock and roll. We're heading down the Mediterranean off to Sicily. And now, also remember, Simmons is in charge, because unfortunately, Simmons' plane crashes. Simmons takes over. and away we go. So the plan itself calls for 1st and 2nd Infantry Brigades to land simultaneously and seize the Pacino Airport. And Matthews believes that the worst case scenario is that these two brigades essentially gain a foothold and don't have any support against counterattack for whatever gains they hold, which is a very logical deduction. They know German doctrine by this point, and especially even from the First World War, is that you try and extend too far and we'll counterattack you and disrupt your gains that you've made. So Matthews recognizes the risks of the artillery being second wave to land, because you have to get off the ship and land the guns and get everything set up. And so his mitigation measure for this and the fire support plan is HMS Roberts is going to provide naval gunfire support, and some 4 destroyers and anti-aircraft cruiser are going to provide support, naval gunfire support to the operation initially. So the plan, he allots, they call them ships forward observation officer parties to coordinate the gunfire battalions. Gunfire to the battalions. So he is allocating specifically to battalions, but from a naval gunfire perspective. And he actually goes as far as putting in the order, the artillery order for Sicily, saying that the landing, that if comms go down, if you are a food, you're going to hand your stuff over. Like if you see a naval gunfire personnel or these forward observation officers in service of naval gunfire, your stuff is their stuff. If it goes down, that is the absolute priority for the landing, and they need to resource it accordingly. So he ends up tasking field regiments to provide direct support to the brigades, but he does something deliberately. He keeps them right close to the boundary line. So you have a boundary brigade each side. He's going to actually physically locate these regiments very close to boundary lines so that they have the range to be centralized if required. So he's kind of like hedging his bets on it. He's decentralizing it and banking on naval gunfire support to mitigate risk, but he's also kind of physically locating them so that if needs be, he can centralize them. Anti-tank goes into the reserve, and essentially you could really call it a simple plan, but it ends up being effective. We know that the amount of pushback they receive or the enemy resistance is not that heavy when they land, but they're in a position to deal with it if it was. So he ends up, they land, and as we know, it kind of goes well for the first 2 weeks. We get a foothold, we start moving. It's really battalion level actions. They're moving up Sicily towards the mainland, and he doesn't need to centralize artillery support for the first 2 weeks of the operation. Everything's rapid, everything's a battalion level engagement. So the person asked the question, this is where the foos shine. The foos and the POs are calling the fire. Matthews isn't really like putting in deliberate fire plans at this point. It's all battalion level engagements. Until we get to Adira. And so he gets to Adira, and we have our first kind of deliberate German defense on the island that we have to kind of stop, go set piece, and kind of figure out how we're going to tackle the problem. So they go there, and Simmons believes that the Germans are going to withdraw to it, occupy it as a defensive position, and he issues orders for 1st Canadian Infantry Brigade with the support of divisional artillery to attack the Soria and secure Adira that evening of July 24th. Simmons believes that the resistance to Adira is light, and that the town itself is going to be actually very heavily defended. As it turns out, Germans are making use of reverse slope, classic stuff again, and the resistance en route is harder than expected. So it's the battle procedure that Matthews receives from Simmons issuing orders to when they need to be firing and step off and support, 14 hours to come up with his first divisional, I guess you could, lack of a better term, set piece plan. So he has 14 hours to execute this, and he ends up creating a fire plan that conforms to those tight timelines. He basically decides, well, if it is this tight, and like he relies on his training, no barrage. We're going to do things that are in a planned and calculated manner, but we're going to forego a barrage, and we're going to use concentrations. So he ends up using multi-battery concentrations on pre-selected targets. So they don't know where everything is on the way up, but they're doing their best guess and analysis of where they believe resistance would be, and they're putting battery level concentrations with some being multi-battery, working a fire support plan as the battalions are scheduled to move up to Gira. And as the battalions advance, this fire plan, the weight of the fire shifts about 1 kilometer every 10 to 20 minutes. And the interesting part of this as well, and it comes to a logistics aspect, 5 rounds per target per gun.
Yeah.
So it's not a heavy rate of fire. It's kind of a very little suppressing, if you could call it that. A lot of the value from artillery comes from that initial shock moment when you have heavy weights of fire disrupting, disorienting defenders, and giving that time and space for the maneuver elements to go through the ground. So they don't have it on this one. 5 rounds per gun per minute assigned to it. And I found it interesting. People call it a barrage in some of the histories. It's not. It's just a bunch of concentrations like worked together in a fire plan.
Yeah, I'm sure I've called it a barrage myself. So
it's all good.
I've done it myself.
So they come up with this plan, and it's unregistered because they don't know the positions. So initially it works like for the first couple minutes, but then we get into the classic conundrum where the fire's shifting onto things, and the things that we think are there are not there, and there's enemy in unexpected areas, and we're not in a capacity to shift the fire back and to deal with that and to integrally support the moving infantry battalions. So the RCR get engaged, the fire support kind of shifts beyond it in accordance with the timings, the attack stalls. So
sorry, can I just put you there real quick because we got a good question. If from David Gribstad about that 5 rounds per minute, is that an ammo issue, or is that because that's the plan that Matthews wants?
I don't know. I can't give you an honest answer on that. I looked for it. I tried to determine it. It could be an ammunition issue, or it could be a poor assessment of what is required because they haven't gone into a heavy action at this point. I was
going to say with Sicily, it's probably both because that happens across the board.
Yep.
Yeah.
As we get into the mainland, we start to see the capacity and road network develop for dumps and for things to pick up. But I would, if I was to take a guess at it, a slightly educated guess, I would go both as well. You're leaning on experience. You haven't fought heavy actions and required a large amount of ammunition, and there's probably a poor logistical network as well.
Well, and then there's supply issues with Sicily off the hop. So, I mean, that's part of it's a well-known part of the Canadian story for Sicily anyway. So.
Okay. So attack stalls. Simmons is like, 2 brigade, you're up. So the second Canadian Infantry Brigade gets orders. Vokes, you're going in, and he orders them to do this in a set piece brigade manner. It is a methodical plan. I mean, the PCLI gets orders to clear out Eastern Soria, and then C4s are going to pass through and go for a year. And Matthews, now that he has a bit more time and space, and they've seen the problem, develops a barrage solution. So they prepare a barrage. They understand from essentially advancing to contact where the enemy is. So they know where the targets are for this barrage. And the plan that Vokes adopts essentially puts the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade into a 2 to 3 square kilometer area. So it's not spread out. It's not expected to be long and in depth. So that allows Matthews to concentrate fires. So even as we have possibly logistical issues that we just talked about, you're keeping your maneuver into a small area and you're allowing concentration of fires. So they set off to support the barrage. And that's the interesting part here as I reread my notes on it. The plan for this one calls for 139 rounds per gun. But the divisional staff actually arranges for 400 rounds per gun to be dropped in each battery position. And it actually gets up to that number, but it takes all of 26 July to complete it. So it takes a full day of resupply to even reach 400 rounds per gun. All the orders are issued. The batteries are doing those technical calculations. And essentially what ends up happening is they concentrate this barrage where one of the regiments puts 2 batteries onto one side of the barrage, another regiment puts 2 batteries on the other side, and the other batteries that are left over are either on call and support in depth, using for smoke, or they're reinforcing things that come up. And to give you kind of a distance for it, it's about 500 meters for each barrage that they plan. So you're looking at about 20 meters between shell impacts, give or take errors with the shells. So you're quite concentrated. You're not spread out, batteries kind of going all over the countryside, searching for targets. You know where it is, and you're concentrating your fire. And then as soon as in the plan, it calls, when we're going to shoot the infantry on the objective, the medium is going to move into depth, and then we're going to prepare for counterattack.
Yeah.
And this works extremely well. The PPCLI rapidly gain their objectives, and the German prisoners' experience with this barrage that is shot. Some of them have experience in North Africa and Poland, and one asked to see the automatic field gun that is laying down.
Oh, right. I forgot about that part. Yeah, I've heard that before. Yeah.
Such a way to fire. But in reality, it's because we have the time and space and battle procedure, we have the geographical space, and we have the capacity from the rounds and the logistical allocation to put an intense barrage down, and it works for the PPCLI at least. Unfortunately, for the C-Force, the barrage isn't able. It's not in a position to assist them with their final capture. So it's kind of a 50% solution. We get our first objectives, but we're not in a flexible state to shift the barrage and change the plan so much that when the C-Force go through, they kind of do it with limited fire support and more of an on-call aspect. So that's the big thing that Matthews organizes in Sicily, and that's his first kind of month and a half CRA. So you can see he has a plan for the landings, ends up not being needed in the form that he thinks the risks are going to be, but he's got mitigation measures intact, and then he's not really cutting his teeth, so to say, until we get to that set piece attack into Jira, and then he has to learn, and he learns that unregistered targets not always ideal, spreading firepower out over long distances not ideal for defensive networks, and then when you have time, space, and most importantly battle procedure time to create these plans, you can effectively use a barrage. So that's the Sicily aspect, and now they move to the mainland.
Yeah, before we jump across the straits, two things from Dave Patterson he makes a good point about I can never say the names of the Sicilian names. I always screw them up. Valguanara, I think I said that right. About being a divisional effort. It's true. It's technically true. I think everyone just thinks of Agira when it comes to Sicily. Again, I've done it.
I acknowledge that too. I would say yes in terms of classification. It is like a first divisional level operation.
Yeah.
I think the intensity, like as he alludes to,
it's the intensity. I think well, because Agira is just such a watershed moment, and like you already said, for Matthews himself, it is. But that's why I like doing these things. Get people throwing some wrenches in, which is always good.
100%.
And then and then another thing, he's also coordinating British units as well, which is
100%.
But anyway, so let's keep moving. Go to the mainland.
All right, so we're on to the mainland. So the campaign moves on the Italian mainland, and we start to see or refine fire planning techniques. September and early October, we're kind of the same thing as we see in early Sicily. Your regimental missions that are forcing those Germans to abandoning their delaying positions as we're gaining a foothold, moving up. There's not a lot of deliberate, hard set piece attacks. September, October, again we're back down at regimental level, supporting hasty attacks. The first, as I view it, on the mainland, the first real test for the divisional fire planning comes when the RCR goes to seize a ridge near the village of San Marco. This ridge, it's got several avenues of approach, and it's very scraggly and rocky. Now we're talking into classic, like people think of Italy, hills, scrag, rock, elevation changes, which is all very problematic for gun calculations and for maneuver operations.
Yep.
To understand the tactical problem of the RCR capture for San Marco, Matthews actually goes forward. So this is another thing that we kind of see from his human aspect and how he commands, is that he goes forward with the brigade commander, the RCR company commanders, and the CO of 2 Field Regiment, who's going to be providing food for the operation. So Matthews realizes that, yeah, this is going to be an interesting problem, and he wants to see it for himself. So he goes forward, he sees the problem, and he's also kind of there to give advice to his COs and their supported arms. So he assesses the terrain and the enemy disposition, and he says, yeah, you're going to get the entire divisional artillery plus an additional medium regiment. So as alluded to earlier, there's sometimes capacity to add other medium regiments or reinforcing regiments in. So in this case, it does. There's a medium regiment to a single battalion attack, and the fire plan is going to call for a barrage supported by other smaller concentrations on particular targets as the RCR will attack up the slope. That being said, unfortunately, and this becomes another one of those learning moments for Matthews and company, is that despite the massive weight, despite the fact that it's a barrage, the operation ends up not going well. The RCR started attacking up the slope on 4 October, and as they move up the slope, the barrage passes them by. And the classic problem, barrage passes them by, they find themselves pinned down by neutralizing fire from machine guns, and the attack starts to stall. Later that evening, they regroup it into a smaller concentration level fire plan, and it allows the RCR to regain the initiative and seize the objectives, but they take very heavy casualties. So in the end, they achieved the tactical objective, but the fire plan could be not really assessed to have helped them to do it. It's more of the initiative from the RCR and the capacity of the RCR to take the objective. So what went wrong? Matthews, essentially, as you can see in the war diaries, he convenes kind of a lessons learned from this incident. He starts to really probe for why the failures occurred at San Marco. And you're going to see some common themes here. The barrage is employed against ill-defined enemy positions. So much like in Sicily, they put a barrage out there, but they hadn't had the time or the capacity to reconnoiter where the actual enemy positions were. And so therefore, they're kind of banking a plan against something that may not be there. And so you're expending rounds onto things that are not enemy positions. And then we start to get into the rocky and precipitous ground, and that starts to come to the concept of registration. Now, for people who kind of wondering what registration is, it's firing on a target to register the data to engage it in the future and to reliably engage it. So you're taking out those non-standard or standard errors that accompany firing an artillery projectile. So meteorological, where we actually think the target is on the ground, where we think our guns are. The procedure takes out a lot of that error and greatly enhances the accuracy of the fire. And this is done, these barrages are done without registration for San Marco. So you can think of and we see it throughout Italy, the problems with some of the mapping and the elevation, add that into technical problems, that also kind of complicates the capacity to do this. So he takes his lessons learned: one, registering targets; two, finding out where the targets are, and two, registering them. So the campaign progresses, and late November 1943, we kind of get ready for the big show for Matthews in Italy and the big show for the 1st Canadian Division. We enter into the Moro River area and the Adriatic coast. So the infantry division moves from Sangro Valley in late November up to the Adriatic coast south of the Moro River. And from an Allied perspective, the 78th British Division breached the Bernard Line, and the Canadians come up to replace them and carry on the fight into the Moro River Valley. In November, 27 November, Vokes, his new JOC, 1 second. Just a sec, I'm busy. Thank you. I knew it was going to happen once.
It's all good.
Always one child. Okay, so Vokes is now the GOC. And Vokes gives the warning order. So Matthews holds an orders group the same day, 27 November, and he outlines how he's going to do divisional fire support to support the relief in place. So because we have to come up and we have to support 78th Infantry Division, so we have to conduct an actual relief in place operation, and that requires the divisional fire plan for it as well. So Matthews, taking his lessons learned from previous, orders a heavy policy of registration. So essentially, as soon as the guns are on the ground, as soon as the guns are placed, and as soon as FOOs are forward in whatever plan happens, where they are, or they happen to be with whatever battalion, they're going to start registration right away. As soon as they have handover from any FOOs in 78th Division, they're going to start taking targets and they're start registering points into the valley. The time they call it ranging at the time,
Right.
and so we start this heavy program of registration. So second and third field regiments arrive on 4 December, and they go to work right away. And then on the morning of 5th December, we have 24-hour period, and you're thinking a regiment comes into place and then fires and then collects the data. By one day, 24 hours, we have registered over 21 targets in a 3-kilometer square area on the frontage of the division. So where we go from Sicily, where no registration, to we are doing very extensively to solve our tactical problems. You can see an evolution. These targets that they register, they get circulated as the uncle targets, so that allows those BCs and those FOOs to use the weight of the division if it should be required in future. And we talked about a little bit earlier as well, is that at this time, Vokes is under extraordinary pressure. So he's getting extraordinary pressure to force a rapid crossing of the Moro and to push into the valley. So the GOC of 5th British Corps, Charles Alfrey, tells him on 4 December, get over the Moro River as soon as possible. And well, Vokes obliges. So he orders 1st and 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigades to reconnoiter possible crossing sites on 4 December. So at the same time, the infantry is starting to do the reconnaissance. We have this heavy registration policy coming in from the divisional artillery. So you can see it's all happening simultaneously. So the reconnaissance reveals that there are some crossing sites in the 2nd Brigade area, but not really much known for enemy defensive positions. But Vokes orders the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade across on the night of 5th December, and 1st Brigade is going to do a diversionary attack, or kind of a feint and supporting attack on the right-hand side. So these registered targets come into great use. So we're going to see, again, we're talking 24 hours. It's a rapid battle procedure. So 4 to 5th December, we got another like 1 day period where we're trying to crank out a plan. So again, barrage is impractical. However, we have registration in place. So now we have the capacity and the flexibility to support these small targets. So what does he do? Matthews places all the divisional artillery in support of 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade on call, and he essentially empowers the fire supporter for 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade to use the divisional assets and the registration policy in place as they see fit to effect the crossing. They forsake preparatory fire in hopes of achieving surprise, and they start to equip FOOs and BCs with the C-Force and the PPCLI as they go forward. As it progresses, the PPCLI gets a foothead, they sneak past and get a bit of a bridgehead, and C-Fort Highlanders conduct some hard fighting to gain a lodgement across the river, but we get the classic problem of the counterattack. So we have PPCLI, we have C-Force across the Moro, but daylight comes, and classic, the Germans realize their position, they start counterattacking hard. And that's where this registered targets really come in handy. An example, Regotti, the FOOs attached to PPCLI, break up 5 Panzer Grenadier counterattacks with registered targets. So it's coming useful, it's saving already established gains. And the FOO for the C-Fort Highlanders ends up calling fire missions basically on his own position to try and break up counterattacks. So we're kind of at that level of fighting on the other side of the river. But unfortunately, the tactical situation, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so the problem is we have infantry forces across the river, but we don't have heavy anti-armor support across it. Yes, the artillery can help, but we're not, unless you're using specific anti-armor assets, we're not a bespoke anti-armor capability with indirect fire. By the evening of 6 December, we've got 2 small pockets, and the FOO is doing great work, but they need to come up with a bit of a more deliberate solution. So now 1 Canadian Brigade gets the orders to go across, and this is where we see we have time and space. And when Matthews has time and space, he's going to try and default to a barrage. He's going to try and default to a kind of a dedicated fire plant and see how that works out. So in support of the 1st Canadian Infantry Brigade attack, he centralized all regiments for concentrations. So it's essentially 5 field regiments and 2 medium regiments is what they got available. And they're starting to fire on targets 60 minutes before 0 hour before they step off. Some histories have described it as searching the far bank for targets. They're kind of like trying to look out, but it's actually, if you go through and compare what they shot and what their registration was, it was pre-registered targets. It was things they had observed, and it was things that they knew where the enemy was at that point. Where targets are registered in this attack, things go smoothly. And the classic problem of where we're firing on things we think they are, but they're not, the attack starts to falter. The RCR, again, unfortunately, the RCR are the non-beneficiaries of fire that's not registered, or it's not flexible, and their attack starts to slow down. But as we learn from this, is that as the Moral River crossing essentially succeeds in the coming days, is that Matthews realizes that if you see it and you register it, any of the resources, any of the time, it works well. But if you're going to do something that's fast-paced and calls for quick reactions, as alluded to in kind of the chat comment, is you need to register and hand it over the FOOs. You can't control it at a divisional level. You have to give the battalions flexibility to beat off with counterattacks. And Matthews kind of takes that to heart after the Moral River. Yeah, and then I guess we can move on to the final fire plan and support.
Yeah, let's do that.
So the crossing, the Moral is affected, and now they're in the Moral Valley, and they're kind of pushing down the valley throughout December. So as the struggle for the valley drags on, Matthews knows that there's going to be a large-scale fight to come, and so he kind of tasks his staff hey, start doing the analysis on if we go back to a divisional level fight with brigades being synchronized again, how are we going to support something in the Moral Valley? We're not going too far. We know Ortona's up there. We know the crossroads. We know where we're going to have to fight over. So he's trying to match an evolving maneuver plan. And, Vokes has committed all of his brigades to the fight, and he's still well short of Ortona by 16 December. So he knows he has to regroup, reorganize, and kind of get ready for whatever the next maneuver plan he's going to order for Ortona. So 16 December, there's a 48-hour pause order, and then a divisional supported set piece attack is going to go in from 1st Canadian Infantry Brigade to allow these regroupings essentially to occur and this pause to occur. The plan that Vokes comes up with calls on 1st Brigade to capture the Cider Crossroads just outside of Ortona. And this is where we see names pop up like Casa Berardi, with the 48 Highlanders supposed to strike northeast to cut it, and then run up to cut that road that runs from Casa Berardi to Villa Grande, and then the RCR moving towards the Cider Crossroads. Essentially, Vokes is looking to concentrate and organize one brigade's fighting power. He's trying to stack it and use it in a manner that it makes best use of it. Mm-hmm. So Matthews has to come up with a plan to support this. So the fire plan he comes up and creates is it's large, it's significant, and it's the most ambitious one that I say he has to date. He has given all of 5th Corps' artillery for the most part.
Right.
Essentially, the Corps artillery at his disposal to create this plan. And his staff are creating what is a Corps level fire plan controlled by the Divisional Artillery Headquarters. There's 2 barrages that are ordered. The first one's called Morning Glory, and it supports the 48th Highlanders attack. And the second one, they codename Orange Blossom, which is shooting the RCR onto the Cider Crossroads. And they're not normal barrages as we would think of. Instead of making a wall of firepower, Matthews recognizes that there's a requirement for a heavy barrage, heavy concentration of firepower, but he needs there's flexibility. He learned from Morrow, we still have to have flexibility in this plan to give the battalions capacity to react to something that occurs that the barrage can't deal with. So 6 field regiments get the barrage, the traditional barrage portions, the Morning Glory and Orange Blossom, and 2 regiments are available for FOOs to use on call, and as well, medium will fire straight flank. So you have a lot of field regiments in the barrage. FOOs for each, you have essentially a regiment per battalion for flexibility, and then he's trying to do kind of a flank cut as a flank protection as they move. It takes hard work to come up with this plan. They're looking at around 500 rounds per gun. So we talked about earlier, there's logistical concerns. But between 16 and 18 December, they get it done in 48 hours. They bring up rounds per gun, have everything in place to execute the plan. When it's time to execute, Matthews controls it at the level, and the reasoning is so complex. And there's two battalions, and it's one brigade plan. There's only a brigade, but there's so many moving parts that he doesn't want to put all the onus essentially on a regimental CO to try and control the fire of a corps. So I think, to me, it's a legitimate analysis and a deduction that he's going to help kind of control that, while still giving the flexibility by having those field residents available to the battalions should they require them, and they do. So initially, the plan works really well. Morning Glory, that barrage is an awesome success. And part of the reason it's a great success is that prior to the 0800 0 hour, the FOOs register the barrage. And so they take the center point where they want the barrage to go, they fire it, and they see where it's on the ground, and they fit it to where they want it. So they mess with it technically, and they make sure it's where it should be before it steps off and starts to do the barrage thing where it lifts and it goes in waves. So the FOOs fire and shoot this barrage to fit the ground 4800. So it fits the ground. When they set off, 48th keeps up to about a 1,000-yard wide curtain of fire that moved 100 yards every 5 minutes, and the concentration on the flanks are really preventing any kind of outside interference. They're creating a box essentially to let 48th Highlander up and to close with and destroy the German positions. For Matthews and staff, there's little to do at this point because it's working well. The fire plan's going. It's, the 48th Highlander by 10:30 in the morning, they're on their objectives and minimal casualties. The NAR after the operation calls Morning Glory an example of, quote, faultless cooperation between artillery, infantry, and armor. And it's great. But unfortunately, as we turn to Orange Blossom, it doesn't work out the same way for the second half of the fire plan. Orange Blossom could arguably called one of Matthew's most tough times or tough decisions he has to make during the entire war. And it requires him to intervene directly as Commander Royal Artillery. So from the first moment that Orange Blossom is fired, it's clear that something is going wrong. The Carleton and York's Battalion, which is on the right flank of the RCR, start radioing in. They have rounds landing in their forward positions. Making matters worse, 48th Highlander, they're mopping up operations that are occurring off of Morning Glory. They start to receive fire as well from the friendly artillery. So it's clear there's something that's not going right. From Matthew's perspectives, he's got two divisional units that are under fire, and the rounds are not landing in line with the fire plan. So he takes the decision. He orders the barrage to lift 400 yards, and he cancels the flank concentration on the side of the Carleton and Yorks. So we have the box, we have an open side of the box now, and where the barrage was, it moves forward. It jumps 400 yards to try and get distance to stop the rounds landing short. Unfortunately, and the official history quote for it, I think it's very succinct, the results are immediate and disastrous. The lifting of fire, the Germans take quick advantage of it, and they start to engage the RCR, and the RCR has to withdraw back to the start line. Could I take a look at it and I think, could Matthews have done something differently? Could he have avoided his decision? Did he have to cancel the concentrations? I think that, yes, he could have done something differently, but he probably made what is the correct decision. It's very hard. Hindsight 2020. We don't know everything that's going on. I find it very, very difficult to be critical of people in these things. You just try and look at the options. You don't try and play what is on it. But faced with the information he had at hand, Matthews made a hard decision. It didn't work out, but at least it gave them some lessons to learn from in the end. And so when they look at the after action, what ends up happening is that the FOOs with the RCR, we don't know why. It's not clear in the histories. They didn't register the barrage. They didn't fit it to the ground. So It's not clear if it's a timing issue. Maybe they didn't have enough battle procedure time to get up there and register it. It's not clear. Did they deem it not necessary? We don't know why. But for whatever reason, the barrage is not registered on the RCR front, and therefore when it starts landing, it doesn't fit the ground. And I have a bit of a graphic with it in the paper, and essentially it's hard to describe, but if you look at it, it's such a compact area because we're talking like battalions and small little objectives within a couple kilometers of each other, that the slightest shift by hundreds of yards, you're into someone else's AO, you're into someone else's territory, and that's where you get these rounds landing short. So, the op order tells the artillery regiments that they have to conduct registration prior to commencement, but it's like this classic thing. It says that there'll be a registration instruction issued separately, but I can't find it. And it's
Right.
not certain if it ever was issued or if it was kind of a verbal thing where 48 time letter foods got the orders. Yes, no, verbal registration, go. This is your orders, and your RCR didn't get it. We don't know, but it didn't happen. So it's unfortunate. Orange Blossom, it's a failure. It's a rare mistake for Matthews, but he takes it to heart. And as we learned from his previous experiences, he does an after action. He really tries to work through the issues of why it occurred. And then as we get to, I don't have scope for it here, but or in the paper, but when he gets to Normandy, he kind of takes those lessons on board. But that ends up being the last major divisional artillery fight that Matthews has in Italy. The Ortona, getting up to Ortona and Ortona after that, because he's pulled back. Simmons goes back. Simmons gets tasked to take command of 2nd Canadian Corps, and Simmons takes him as his commander corps artillery, so CCRA, and Matthews leaves Italy in the new year and starts planning that. But I mean, in retrospective, there's a lot of interesting things, even from his militia career up to Italy as a commander for Matthews.
Yeah, it's like I said, that's the fascinating part when we didn't even get to Normandy. Like that's the whole thing, right? And then his continued rise after that. So I just want to, but this is a good question. Sorry, my mouse went to sleep. From Scott again. Couldn't the artillery be redirected to the proper coordinates?
So the phrase proper coordinates is part of the problem here. So in the area, there's mapping issues with what the actual coordinates are. And there's, like I described, issues of knowing where you are and your guns are on the ground. So that it's, yes, you can make a correction, but can you correct an entire barrage plan? So it's not just one regiment, it's multiple regiments. And the answer is yes, it could have happened, but it would have taken time. And I believe that Matthew's analysis was, there's not enough time to do this. I need to make a decision to quickly keep the attack pace and momentum going. I'll have to take a risk and I'll have to do this. So short answer, yeah, it could have occurred and you could have gone back and re-registered, but I don't think that there was legitimately time based on the tactical scenario for them to do that.
Yeah, particularly at this area. I mean, the fight for the Crossroads is one of those legendary fights in the terms of its, horribleness. I don't know what other word to use because it just goes wrong in certain elements, just like the fighting in Italy always does. There's the success followed by failure, followed by success, and then failure again. But yeah, it's just because there's so many moving parts, right? And that's kind of what we were talking about, and kind of a theme I think I pulled from your paper, right? Is that flexibility, but also that weight of fire. You got to balance, and I think Matthews, and I think your conclusion is that Matthews was learning and getting better at it. It takes experience, it takes time, and these are different conditions. Again, the conditions had changed at the Moral River, so it's just so many moving pieces. But unfortunately, I can't really get into that today because we've already done an hour and a half. So just to kind of wrap up, but no, that was great. That was amazing. Learning all those details, getting down into how Matthews dealt with all of this. And also, as well, Dave would know, radio issues.
Yeah, exactly.
Constant, particularly in Italy. That's always a constant thing. Just those signals can't get through those hills sometimes. It happens. Still a thing, and Dave would know. Anyway, so one question I just kind of wanted to wrap up with, because this is where the paper ended, is he's not known enough. What would you like to see on Matthews? Does he deserve that full-out that biographical treatment? Do you think that's what you'd like to see?
Yeah, so I don't think he's certainly not well known enough as a figure in the Canadian historiography, as you allude to. The selfish part of me says, let me do it, but someday if I were to do a PhD. But I mean, someone needs to keep the torch going, and I think there's at least 2 to 3 more things on Matthews that need to be looked at. And the next thing, there could definitely be a scope for way more in depth for Italy and Sicily. I mean, there's only like 40 pages I wrote on it. There's way more depth for that.
Yeah, there's lots here.
Yeah, there's lots. But Normandy and his role as the CCRA and dealing with all the personalities and how he he kind of dealt with the Normandy fight and Total Eyes and Tractable. Tractable, I've done some previous work on battle procedure for Tractable, and there's some interesting stuff there from a battle procedure perspective. So I think it's CCRA time. And then I think really the part that would really wrap it up and drive it home, especially the human aspect of it, is that he was extraordinarily successful, in my opinion, as a commander when he takes over the 2nd Infantry Division after the Scheldt.
Yeah.
Because it is, it's roughed up. It's been through a lot of heavy fighting, not both in Normandy and through the Scheldt campaign. And as a gunner commanding the infantry division, he definitely navigates those, and he takes the division through veritable linebacker and like all the Rhineland stuff, and he fights those campaigns up to the end. So I think there's a lot of scope that needs to be looked at for how did he fight as a gunner in charge of an infantry division, and how did he take his experiences having to support. There's a quote, I like it. I'm a gunner, so I like it. Essentially, he says in one of the interviews with Granatstein, he's like, I knew the infantry and the Ira better than they knew themselves.
I wonder why you like that so much.
Because he has the territory. And then, military history aside, there's an interesting aspect of him post-war that I think should be looked at, and that is so post-war he doesn't stay in the armed forces. He goes back to kind of the family business, but he ends up being the president of the Liberal Party of Canada in late 50s, early 60s. And he does that for a time. And he was actually considered to be one of the first Canadian governor generals, but was discounted because of his Liberal Party connections. They thought it would be essentially too politically connected for him to do that. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that he was our Colonel Commandant in the 1960s as well. But I think there's a far larger scope, because like Hoffmeister, there's something special about Bruce Matthews in the way his human command, his human connections are done, and how he navigates those worlds. And it's difficult because we don't have access yet. Hopefully I can get it sometime at the War Museum to his actual papers that were donated. Right now, this is all based off war diaries and other people's perspectives. Hopefully there's some perspectives from himself that we can get out there. I do know, speaking to his son, that there is also potentially a project in the works that his son was looking at. I'm not sure if it ever came off the ground, where Matthews wrote a bunch of letters to his wife during the wartime, and was actually looking at the human connection between him and his wife, through obviously censored, because there's also a very deep family connection that he has. He has children before he leaves in 1939-40. I think it might have been actually on a visit back. And there's a very moving part in the way to command, where essentially he comes home from the war and his children are about 4 or 5 at the time, and they say, Mom, who's that man? And it's just like, Einstein is moved when he sees this, and you can't read that paragraph and not be moved. But I think there's plenty of scope to look at Bruce Matthews. There's plenty of scope for all the gunners, not just Matthews, Ziegler, Plow. I think that this, as we move through the evolutions of the historiography in Canada, I won't say we're coming to an end on Simmons and McNaughton, but we have a lot. Cop, Art of Command, Rickard's going to have some stuff. Like we have a lot. I think there's scope for the support now.
Yeah, I was going to say, sorry, I agree. I think we need to take that, I guess, personal approach. I don't know. I just think of the United States, and every commander down to, I don't know what level, there's books, there's something. Here, I guess it's just a numbers thing. There's just not that many of us, but I think that personal thing is becoming interested. And again, that combined arms. I mean, maybe that's the way in here. Maybe we got to entice somebody with those combined arms to do Matthews, because I think that might be the way in. Just again, thinking of what I know and the people I know and how this goes about. But yeah, we'll see. I mean, can't control all of historiography, but yeah. Oh, sorry, there's one thing here. Before I forget, from Dave again, 2div needs to be folks. Sorry, I got thought of my own. That was awesome. I think I need to get that. I need to screenshot that and keep that. That's good. I like that. Dave's cracking me up. Anyway, yeah. So people really enjoyed it. So thanks for coming on. Again, it's awesome to hear this in depth on an individual, but then also get into the operations and how their personality affects things and how they go about things. Again, I'm not in the military, but just again, that again, the combined arms thing to me, I think is what's going to stick with me, because he had that sort of, again, correct me if I'm wrong, foresight about how to do this and take those steps, learn from mistakes, but keep going. Because sometimes the Canadians, particularly in Normandy, had a bit of trouble with kind of readjusting. They eventually get there, but it takes some time. So it's really good to see.
Yeah, totally agree. I think, as you mentioned, it's that human aspect, right? The combined arms. How do we integrate? And there's the Canadian aspect to it. How do we work as a team between the combined arms and the personalities at play? Because I think a lot of the, like you mentioned, a lot of historiography is about this individual and they liked or did not like and worked well or did not work well. But Matthew is an example of like there are individuals, there are people that the glue that makes the team work from the Canadian Army perspective in the Second World War, and they need some light too.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I mean, I linked down below because you mentioned in your paper, The Generals by Granatstein, because that's probably the best that one people know. And it just, we need bigger than that, right? We need to drill down, which is happening, like I said. But okay, one last question, if that's okay.
Yep.
I don't think you have an answer to this because of the problem with the papers, but if there's anything that come across and how he thought about higher levels of some of these, particularly in Italy.
Yeah, so I unfortunately I don't have an answer based on lack of access to the papers. I can give an answer to Canadian perspective.
Sure.
Like he thought highly of Simmons. He integrated well with Simmons,
Yep.
and it seemed like there was no issue with Vokes. Like he's not. And the very interesting thing is like the interviews he has with Granatstein for Way to Command that he ends up making into Way to Command and others is that a lot of it is he's very hesitant to be assigning blame, and he understands a lot of the kind of like the teamwork aspects. So no idea of Monty, Lisa, or Alexander,
Yeah.
but I know favorable of his immediate higher command.
Yeah, which is great. And I'm going to be going to the War Museum probably next week, so I will ask them what's going on because I know quite a few people there. So I'll be like, "Yeah, what's up?" Anyway, so yeah, so thanks for coming on again. I'm just going to do a quick sign off, and then we'll log off together. Okay.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me.
Yep. So thanks everyone for watching. This was a really, really interesting talk. Stephen did a great job and going into the details on this stuff. And hopefully, again, this conversation might lead a spark to do someone else doing this, or we convince Stephen to do the PhD. I don't know. It might seem a little mean to make him do it, but hey, that might be the way it is. So anyway, thanks for watching. Another live stream tomorrow, different time though than kind of usual, 6 p.m. So I have Alexandria McKinnon coming on to talk about kind of institutional looks at grief and loss of the First World War. We're going to take a Canadian perspective, but we're also going to kind of transnational it because she's based out of Australia, hence why the time's a little wonky. So that one will be an interesting one. So jump back with us tomorrow. I'll do some more posting about it so people can check that out. So it should be a really interesting one, kind of go a different direction and kind of look at a different war again tomorrow. But yeah, it'll be really, really interesting one. So thanks for coming on. Did you enjoy yourself? Didn't make it too difficult for you?
No, it was great. I loved it. Always happy to chat Canadian military history. Due to postings and jobs and staff calls last year, I've kind of been out of it for a little while, but I'm happy to get back into it.
Yeah, and that's great to hear it, and the passion obviously comes through. So, and people are already in favor of you doing the PhD. So, yeah.
Put that in there somewhere.
We're always tricking people into doing more work. That's kind of one of the things we do here at OTD. Anyway, so thanks everyone for watching, and have a good night. And I'll see everybody tomorrow for our next live stream. Have a good night, everybody.